planning on mostly talking about the three temptations and also how they challenge us to overcome day by day. But I always find myself wanting to connect a little bit to the other two scriptures, and I think they also move toward these temptations because they move us toward this new covenant that begins with this first covenant of the rainbow. And we've always made of this story, I think especially since we make it children's time a lot, and if there's any children's story we tell in Sunday school, it's the Noah story, but we like to focus on the covenant because that's the good part of the story, not the wiping out everybody. But here in this good story, we have this rainbow. And I thought, I don't know, this week it just struck me how interesting it is that God, if God were a human being, writes with these big colored pencils and makes a big bright signature with bright colors. My wife and I often have conversations about whether bright reds and yellows are not in good taste, but at least when they're on walls in your house. But she always wins, by the way, on that one. But so we don't have bright reds and golds. But I've always loved this idea of God splashing his signature out in bright colors. But what is he covenanting to it? He's covenanting to that he will never destroy the earth again. Now, I know that if you're of a legal mind, you go and you look at that little bit that says by water. But I want to suggest to you that when Jesus comes, Jesus is God's new plan to try to save us in a new way. Not by destruction, not by this covenant, this wiping out of everyone that we saw in the Noah story in the flood, where God says with bright colors that I promise you safety with me and blessing. And Jesus is the answer partly to that. Jesus is the one who comes once again to save people, not through a flood, not through destruction, but in his presence and his own sacrifice. And I know, yes, there are places, and we certainly look at Revelations, where there's conversations about apocalypse that have to come, and that Jesus' second coming will somehow be tied to that. Although I think I want to suggest to you, and I think 1 Peter even helps me with this some, that for a destruction of the world, we are quite capable on our own now. We have the technology and power. And when you look at most of these apocalyptic stories, they sound like a nuclear war. They sound like stuff we're perfectly capable as human beings of destroying ourselves. So Jesus offers us an opportunity to become something other than destructive people, but to become people of God. And you see this in 1 Peter, where he reminds us back that Noah, where only 8 people were saved, might also point out all the other creatures as well, because that reminds us that that's important to God too. It's not just people. But Peter just focuses on 8 people were saved, but in Jesus is through baptism there, and he makes it, it's an interesting way he talks about baptism. Remember, baptism reminds us of the waters, because just like the waters, and I think one of our readings was saying that our baptism is a water is a way of new birth. So we're let go, we die to the old to be born to the new. We die, and that old life is stopped so that we have a new life. And of course, water is part of human birth as well. So all of that comes into that idea that in baptism, when we commit to Christ, we're made new. But notice how 1 Peter wrote that baptism is an appeal to God for a good conscience. That indicates that while we go through baptism, our conscience is now awake to the possibilities of being like God, but it's only an appeal to it and doesn't necessarily shift our human nature. It's something we're always working on. The baptism is something that we're always wrestling with. We're always struggling to find that way to follow Jesus to new life. But it's an appeal to our conscience. It's not a finished project, so that we're in this project of dealing with the temptations that draw us away from God throughout our lives. Maybe that's why we have to come around. We have a church year that reminds us to come back around and deal with some of these issues, like the temptations. So we have the temptations of Jesus. And both, Mark mentions them briefly, that there are temptations, but doesn't say much more about them. Mark and Luke both mention these three, but interestingly enough, they switch the second and third positions. And I don't know that I've ever read anybody that knows why they did that, but mostly we understand that because Mark had a different emphasis than Luke, that they're trying to put emphasis on one more than the other. It seems to me that the last one is maybe the one they're trying to really home in. But we're looking at the Luke's version of this today. I've looked at these scriptures over the years and had several different interpretations myself as I've tried to say, what do they say to us about how we live our lives? But while I've been doing the School of Ministry for the last 2 or 3 years, we used a book by Henry Nouwen called In the Name of Jesus. And Henry Nouwen is sort of the icon mentor of pastoral care. And my class I do is on care and nurture. And I think in seminary I must have had to read at least 2 or 3 books of Nouwen's, his most famous one being The Wounded Healer. The idea for pastors that you go in not to heal, but you're needing healing yourself is kind of the concept of it. And so Henry Nouwen always looks at that from kind of a pastoral care perspective. But Henry is an academic person. He's written lots of books, and so he's kind of raised up in the church as an authority on how we look at the church, how we look at pastoral care especially. He's a Catholic priest, and he spent most of his life in academia. But this book is about a shift in his life where he thought somehow he was getting a little too far removed from what God wanted him to be doing by being this authority on theology. And so he went and began to work at the L'Arche Communities for the Mentally Handicapped. And there kind of discovered a new way of doing ministry as he realized in these facilities, these homes for folks with limited mental abilities, that he wasn't such a big authority, and they reacted more to him, how are you being today? Are you being nice to me? Are you doing something useful today? And they didn't mind saying, that was dumb, Henry. Or, they're just folks that were very straight up. And so it shifted his way of thinking about several things. But his book, In the Name of Jesus, actually talks primarily about these 3 temptations. And he looks at them from in the 3 ways I hadn't really thought about before, so I want to share that with you today. And the temptations of stones into bread, Nouwen calls this the temptation to be relevant. And this is a quote. I just picked out a couple of quotes and then I'll comment on them. God has chosen us not because of what we do or accomplish, but because God has created us and redeemed us in love and has chosen us to proclaim that love is the true source of all human life. But the secular world around us is saying in a loud voice, quote, we can take care of ourselves. We do not need God or the church. We are in control. And if we are not, then we have to work harder to get in control. And the problem is not lack of faith, but lack of competence. If you are sick, you need a competent doctor. If you need a house, you need a competent architect and construction, etc., etc. So this idea of what we produce and what we create is what gives us value, is what the world says to us. To be relevant, as Nouwen is saying. I think in today's world, and this week we might be brought attention to one of the ways that relevancy, I think, has taken over our world is our love of technology and our inability maybe to even be in control of technology. Obviously, the smartphone has made things a lot easier and better in many ways. But we also know that technology distracts us from each other. So even as we connect on Facebook, we get further and further away from one another. We do, from time to time, try to put controls on that because we see where it can even cause danger and hazard. So we pass laws that you can't text while you're driving, for instance, realizing that people are so absorbed in their phones that they forget that they're in a moving vehicle going down the road. And so we actually say, well, what can we do about that? And we pass laws. We've been reading this week again in the news that social media was used in the campaigns. And although, as I was having this debate with my daughter, she pointed out that while the Russians may have used that to create polarization and to fan polarization and to also do negative ads, that she has plenty of friends that do some of the same stuff themselves, and she knows they're not Russian. So we may get some of that going, but we know that we have a lot of issues. If we look, say, at the First Amendment, which talks about free speech, we know that in those days, false information or angry information or fanning the flames could only touch a few people at a time. And now with this technology, it can spread out in huge numbers to give wrong information or to create anger about things that didn't even happen, create fear. And so we are always raised with the question about, well, what do we do about that technology? And you know, as we look at the shootings, we realize one of the things that's changed since the Second Amendment was written is the technology. Our technology for one person to kill many people is much advanced over what it was in 1776. You know, the rifles you were allowed to have in 1776 could shoot one shot, and it was really hard to load it and unload it. So you really didn't have the technology. So we have part of what we're dealing with is a technology issue, and going back to an archaic way of looking at a time when they didn't even have any concept of that kind of technology. So what responsibility, as we who created that technology, do we have to put some controls on that technology? All of those are questions of, is it more important to be relevant and to do whatever we want to do as long as we have the power to do it, or do we have to say we have a responsibility to other people, we have responsibility to control, or in terms of the temptation, we have a responsibility to God? Nouwen goes on to say on this one about relevance, he says, after you hear what the world says, yet beneath all the great accomplishments of our time, there is a deep current of despair. The leaders of the future, the leaders of the church of the future, will be those who dare to claim their irrelevance in the contemporary world as a divine vocation that allows them to enter into deep solidarity with the anguish underlying all the glitter of success and to bring the light of Jesus there. So that what God calls us to is not this worldly relevance, but the ability to connect to people that are lost and broken, and not about what we produce, but how we relate. How do we connect? How do we share? And of course, we realize that part of the issue in the shootings, too, another aspect of that, because it's not a simple thing, is this despair that is in our culture of people who feel left out and forgotten. This despair. And then the despair that spreads through all of us as we say, well, what do we do about what's happening? But we may not be always able, but the answer to that by now, and I think God's person, is how do we reach out to the lost? How do we connect to people? How do we make our choices about community over profits? How do we decide on what's God's purpose rather than what's most productive? And it's not a call to be non-productive. In fact, I think the challenge is to be relevant, but relevant for God's purpose. When we create things for the world, when we have things that create new possibilities, do we use those for God's purposes or for other purposes? What is the goal of our relevancy? Are we relevant so that others' lives are made better? Is it relevant so that people are safer? Are we relevant so that what we create makes a better world? Because sometimes we know that products are made because they make profits, not because they do anything good at all. Other things do good, but they also do bad. How do we take responsibility? How do we answer that question? The second temptation, and this is the one I don't know if this one needs a lot of explanation, because this one we all understand, the temptation to be powerful. You know, politicians have long said, but little practice, service to the people. And it's not just politicians, but it seems like politicians use that phrase more often about we come to serve. You know, you could say the same thing really about anybody who's in a place of responsibility, that they come to serve the group. That would be whether you're in a church setting, business setting, political setting. But we hear it a lot from politicians. But the idea is that when you have power and authority, it is meant so that you can serve the needs of the many, not the needs of yourself. That's the reason people are given authority and power, is so they can use it for the good of the many. To set in the place of responsibility is to listen to one's community over one's particular ego or your own personal needs. Now, granted, that's not how we see power. We often see power used in exactly the opposite way. As I mentioned last week, I've been reading a book about Harry Truman. And as I thought about this service to people, the story about his service in World War I, he was an artillery captain. He had a battalion or a battery under him, which I think was about 179 men that were under his responsibility. But he is pictured in this autobiography, and this seems to come true in his soldiers that were under him pretty much always supported him throughout his political life. So his connection to that group of people was powerful. He connected to them. But his understanding of being a leader was that he never asked more of them, his people, than he was willing to do himself. And he always made sure they were cared for. If some of them had a need, and some of the soldiers didn't have as much pay as he did, he sometimes would loan money to folks. And Harry Truman was never wealthy, by the way. But he'd loan it to them if they needed it, because he always thought about what do my troops need. And interestingly enough, he came back from that war with only 3 casualties, and the casualties happened while they were working with somebody else. And so he took a great deal of pride in that idea that he always was watching out. He did his duty, he did what was necessary, but he also was always asking the question, how do I care for those beneath me that I'm responsible for? And he compared himself to the guys who were captains like Prussians. Now, I realize that's a comment on a group of people, but I think the comment was those people in power, and we've all known the two differences of the way people do leadership, of those who always had to have it their way, and the reason they had underlings was to do the crummy jobs they didn't want to do. They had no respect for the people that worked for them. I mean, there's 2 different kinds of leaderships. So Nouwen is talking about how when he came into this residence of folks, and was more one-on-one with people who didn't hold him up in such leadership, that he began to realize leadership was different. And to the extent, and this quote from him, to the extent to which my leadership was still based around a desire to control complex situations or confused emotions and anxious minds, I was limited. And he said, I struggled with getting control with this mystery of leadership that for a great part means being led. This idea of leadership that in a great deal means being led. And he suggests one of the greatest ironies of the history of Christianity is that its leaders, like all people, it's not that Christian leaders are different. That's unfortunate, but because they're supposed to be. But Christian leaders are also caught up in the temptation of power. And if we look at history, we see inquisitions that led to. We see the Crusades. We see enslavement of native peoples in the name of God. All kinds of places where power took over from being Christ. We could see this probably most recently in the Me Too movement that shows how people in power thinks that's a license to abuse. Nouwen makes the comments, maybe it is that power offers an easy substitute for the hard work of love. It seems easier to be God than to love God, easier to control people than to love people, easier to own life than to love life, easier to follow what pleases me rather than what pleases God. And perhaps more than any of the other dangers, and Matthew puts this one last, so I think Matthew thought this might be the most dangerous temptation. We all know the danger of power as overcoming benevolent. People sometimes come to places of authority and they have something really wonderful they want to do. But then they start thinking it's so important that they run over everybody to get to this benevolent purpose, and the benevolent purpose is lost in the destruction of the people they force to do. I mean, it happens time and time again that the cause becomes more important than the people you serve, which also I think ties back to the not being relevant, but being loving. The final temptation in Luke is of course, the throwing yourself off the temple. And he calls this the temptation to be spectacular. And I thought I think I like that one best of all of his interpretations. The temptation to be spectacular, to get applause. Now, I remember when I was a teenager, my brother and I thought it'd be great if we started a rock band. I mean, don't old teenagers think about that? And we thought a lot about what our dress would look like and what kind of ambiance we would create and what kind of message we would have. The only thing we didn't have that got in our way was no talent or practice. But now we live in an age where people with absolutely no talent have shows and are famous. They're called reality shows. And no talent, they just do stupid things or crazy things or they're obnoxious. And that makes it a show and people watch it. And they're called reality stars. So we see this around us all this time, this desire to be famous even when, and I think some of this, and this may go back to some of our gun violence too. We know that the young man whose grandmother found and stopped him, that his goal in his diaries was to get more killings than anybody else had, to be spectacular in a very negative way, but it didn't seem to matter because he had also disconnected from community, because it was all about individualism, and he had lost his sense of community and being part of community. And in order to be found, he thought he had to be spectacular. So we have this spectacularism need. It's our culture, and we see it all the time where it's not about your community, it's about how do I get attention? And it doesn't even have to be good attention. Now, the way Nouwen puts it, stardom and individual heroism, which are such obvious aspects of our competitive society, are not at all alien to the church. There are, and everywhere, the dominant image is not of the self-made man or woman who can do it all alone. That's this idea of the self-made man is a dominant image in our culture. A fiction, I think, of our cultural narcissism, not to know, because a lot of times you say people, they'll say I'm self-made, and they totally don't see all the people that supported them throughout their lives, parents, educators, trainers, people that just supported them lots of ways. And that seems to be kind of a cultural thing where we lose track of all the people that we connect with that help raise us up, and we start thinking it's just us. We do it all. Or if we don't get that feeling, we want it to be just us. We want to get applause. The signs that our society is doing this is just all around us. Now, Nouwen says the answer to this is confession and forgiveness are the concrete forms in which we sinful people love one another. Now, Nouwen is a Catholic, so I think to some extent he meant that in the concrete sense of confession. But I want to suggest to you that I think as we build relationships with one another, if we start thinking beyond what is it good for me individually, but we start asking how can I share my life with others and have others share their lives with me, we know that confession and forgiveness are necessary, don't we? How often have we had an argument with a friend, family, children, and we end up saying it's all their fault? That's where confession comes in. Confession is saying, well, maybe if I hadn't called them a dummy in the middle of that conversation, it would have come out better. You know, confession is that willingness to say, here, I could have done that different. And of course, forgiveness is the obvious. We have to forgive them for the fight, and they have to forgive us in order to keep going on. Because if you hold those grudges, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so confession and forgiveness becomes kind of a key, I think, for us learning how to not be individuals after being spectacular, but to be a part of community where what we add to the world is what we add together. And it's not about raising me up and making me get all the applause, but about all of us making progress and changing the world into the image that God creates of this community of place where all people are valued and all people are cared for. Whether they're relevant or not, they have value. They are important. So the redemption I think we offer in Christ is the knowledge that each person has value. And for 1 Peter, we are told that baptism, which is the beginning of new life, that the water of birth reminds us of the covenant after the flood, that says you are made, that Jesus is a new covenant. It's not about a destruction, it's about a creation, it's about possibility. Jesus is about possibility, new persons, not the old, not about destruction, but creation. We are made new in Jesus. That's the call of Jesus, that each of us is to be made new in Jesus. Not to be relevant, not to be powerful, not to be spectacular, but in order to share God's love with every other person we meet. Amen. Let's share our time in our time of offering.